August 18th, 1966, the Viet Cong spotted 6 Australian soldiers carrying rifles that fired just one bullet at a time, and they actually laughed out loud. These guerrilla fighters had automatic weapons, superior numbers, and a perfect ambush position already set up. So how did those 6 undergunned Aussies turn the tables and wipe out an entire enemy force in just over 2 minutes without losing a single man? Phuoc Tuy Province, Vietnam, 30 kilometers northeast of Vung Tau, deep in Australian Task Force territory. The jungle stretched in every direction like a green ocean with no shores. Inside that ocean, 6 men moved slower than shadows. The Viet Cong had studied these Australians for months. Their intelligence officers wrote detailed reports. They passed these reports from unit to unit, commander to commander. The reports all said the same thing. The Australians carried old-fashioned rifles, semi-automatic rifles, 1 bullet per trigger pull, 20 rounds total before you had to reload. The Americans carried M16s that could fire 700 rounds every minute. The Americans had M60 machine guns that could cut down entire tree lines. But these Aussies, they had rifles that the Viet Cong called pea shooters. One captured report spelled it out clearly. Australian reconnaissance teams carry inferior weapons, heavy caliber weapons preferred for ambush. The 274th Viet Cong Regiment believed this completely. Why wouldn't they? On paper, it made perfect sense. Sergeant Bob Wilson led his patrol 8 kilometers west of Nui Dat, the main Australian base. Everyone called him Spider. He'd been a soldier for 5 years already. He'd trained in Malaya with British instructors who understood jungle fighting in a way most people didn't. Spider moved like he was part of the jungle itself. His 5 men followed his every signal, his every pause, his every breath. The heat pressed down like a weight you could feel in your bones. 38 degrees Celsius. The humidity sat at 95%. Sweat soaked through their jungle green uniforms within minutes of starting patrol. The fabric clung to skin. Water dripped from foreheads, noses, chins. But they didn't make a sound. Not a single metallic click, not a whisper, not even heavy breathing. The jungle had its own sounds. Cicadas screamed their endless song. Birds called from the canopy high above. Leaves rustled in slight breezes that never reached the ground. The smell of wet earth and rotting plants filled every breath. The weight of their equipment pulled at shoulders and backs. Every step had to be tested before committing full weight. A snapped branch could mean death. The Americans fought differently. Spider had seen it with his own eyes. American patrols moved with 30 to 40 men, sometimes more. They crashed through the undergrowth with radios crackling static every few minutes. Helicopters flew overhead, announcing their position to every enemy within 10 kilometers. Artillery stayed on standby, ready to rain shells at the first sign of trouble. The Americans moved 6 to 8 kilometers every single day. They wanted contact. They wanted to find the enemy, engage them, count the bodies, and call it a win. Body count was the American metric for success. More dead enemies meant you were winning. Firepower was the American solution to every problem. If you made contact, you called in everything. Artillery, helicopter gunships, jet fighters with bombs and napalm. You buried the enemy under explosive weight until nothing moved, but it wasn't working. The 274th Viet Cong Regiment had spent 3 months studying American patterns. They knew exactly what Americans would do. They could hear Americans coming from hundreds of meters away. The metallic sounds of equipment, the radio static, the helicopter rotors getting louder. The VC set up perfect ambushes along routes they knew Americans would use. L-shaped ambushes that caught patrols in a crossfire with no escape. The VC had learned something else too, something the Americans called hugging. When Americans made contact, they needed distance to use their firepower advantage. Artillery couldn't help if the enemy was 20 meters away. Napalm would kill your own men if dropped too close. So the VC rushed forward the moment contact happened. They closed the distance to 20 or 30 meters. They threw grenades. They used their AK-47s on full automatic. At that range, American firepower became a problem instead of a solution. American casualties in Phuoc Tuy province had tripled in just 6 weeks. Something was very wrong. The Australians operated on different rules, but the commanders back at headquarters weren't sure if different meant better. Spider's patrol had moved just 1.2 kilometers in 6 hours. 6 hours for barely over 1 kilometer. They ate 1 cold meal per day, no cooking fires, no hot food, no comfort. They communicated entirely with hand signals. They watched, they listened, they followed tracks in the dirt and broken spider webs in the brush. They were hunting, but when contact came, they'd face enemies with superior firepower. The AK-47 held 30 rounds and could dump all of them in seconds. The SKS rifle could fire almost as fast. The VC had RPD machine guns that made the Australian F1 rifles look like toys from another century. Every tactical manual said the side with more automatic weapons would win the firefight. Spider's point man stopped moving. His hand came up. Fist closed. Enemy movement, 40 meters ahead. Everyone froze exactly where they stood. Not a single muscle twitched. Breathing slowed to almost nothing. Spider waited for the next signal. The point man's fingers moved. 15 to 20 enemies, setting up an ambush, trail junction ahead. Spider shifted position so slowly a watching bird wouldn't have noticed. He looked through a gap in the thick leaves and vines. There they were, Viet Cong fighters, maybe 20 of them. They were setting up an ambush position along a trail that connected to other trails. This was the exact type of position that had killed dozens of Americans in the past month. The perfect trap. And the Viet Cong were laughing, actually laughing. Spider could hear them talking in low voices, relaxed, confident. They hadn't seen the Australians. They had no idea 6 men with inferior weapons were watching them from 40 meters away. They were positioning themselves perfectly, weapons pointing down the trail, backs exposed to the hillside where Spider's team sat invisible in the thick jungle. They were setting up an ambush for the wrong enemy. They expected Americans to come crashing down that trail with radios and helicopters and noise. They expected to have every advantage: superior numbers, automatic weapons, surprise. The Americans would walk right into the kill zone and die before they knew what happened. But Spider and his men didn't fight like Americans. They'd learned from British instructors who'd spent years fighting communists in the Malayan jungle. They'd learned patience. They'd learned to become invisible. They'd learned that the jungle wasn't their enemy. The jungle was their weapon. And those F1 rifles everyone called obsolete, they were about to prove that speed of fire meant nothing compared to accuracy of fire. Spider's hand moved, slow, deliberate. His men understood instantly. They were going to kill everyone down there, not capture, not drive off, kill. And they were going to do it in a way that would make the 274th Viet Cong Regiment change every tactical manual they had. The F1 rifle wasn't a weakness. It was a completely different way of thinking about combat. While Americans trained to put as many bullets downrange as possible, the Australian SAS trained for something else entirely. Every single bullet mattered. Every shot had a purpose. You didn't spray and pray. You aimed and killed. The rifle forced this discipline into your bones. 20 rounds total. That meant 20 decisions. 20 moments of aim, breath control, trigger squeeze. You couldn't panic and dump your magazine into the trees. The weapon wouldn't let you. Fire too fast and you'd be reloading while enemies were still shooting. So you learned to make every single bullet count. The British had proven this system worked in Malaya. They'd fought communist guerrillas for years in jungle just like this. Small teams with careful shots had destroyed enemy forces that should have won on paper. The Australians learned from those British instructors. They took the lessons, practiced them thousands of times, and brought them to Vietnam. Spider's team showed exactly what this meant in real numbers. An American patrol of 35 men carried 2,800 rounds of M16 ammunition. They carried 1,200 rounds for their M60 machine guns. They had 40 M79 grenade launcher rounds. They carried a PRC-25 radio that reported their position every hour. They moved 6 to 8 kilometers every day. They stayed in the field for 7 days, then rotated back to base. Spider's 6-man team carried 120 at a rounds total, 20 rounds per man, 12 M26 hand grenades for the whole team. They checked in by radio once every 24 hours, just once. They moved 1 to 2 kilometers per day, sometimes less. They stayed in the field for 14 to 21 days straight. Same jungle, same enemy, completely different methods. But the real difference went deeper than numbers. It was about rewiring how your brain worked under stress. SAS selection got rid of anyone who couldn't control their panic response. Training pushed men to the absolute edge. They ran scenarios where pretend enemies walked within arm's reach, and you had to let them pass without moving, without breathing hard, without your heart rate spiking. You learned to override every instinct screaming at you to fight or run. The Viet Cong noticed. Their captured documents from late 1966 showed the change. Australian reconnaissance teams are ghosts. They see without being seen. Do not assume you have the advantage even with superior numbers and automatic weapons. They shoot once and do not miss. The F1 had other advantages too. It could hit targets accurately at 200 meters. The AK-47 started losing accuracy past 150 meters. That 50-meter difference meant Australians could kill enemies who couldn't effectively shoot back. The F1 fired a 7.62 millimeter NATO round. That bigger, heavier bullet punched through jungle plants that would deflect the smaller bullets from AK-47s. And the F1 worked reliably in mud and humidity. Early M16s jammed constantly in Vietnam's wet conditions. Men died trying to clear jammed rifles while enemies shot at them. But the real secret was how the Australians used these rifles. They developed something called the immediate ambush drill. American training taught fire and maneuver. One group shoots to keep enemy heads down, while another group moves to a better position. Back and forth. Move and shoot. Move and shoot. The SAS taught something different. Fire and annihilate. 6 men with 120 rounds couldn't afford to waste bullets keeping heads down, so every member of the patrol knew exactly what to do. They understood the geometry of the kill zone, overlapping fields of fire, maximum 15-meter depth. Every shooter had an assigned section to cover. No overlap meant no wasted shots. The ambush only triggered when targets filled the entire kill zone. No stragglers outside the killing area, no one running away to warn others. Everyone inside. Then you fired, and you didn't stop until nothing moved. Spider's men had practiced this exact scenario 200 times. In darkness, in pouring rain, in fake villages. They'd fired until loading a new magazine happened without thinking, until aiming became automatic. Sight picture. Control your breathing. Squeeze the trigger smoothly. Watch the target fall. Find the next target. Fire again. Their training scores showed they could wipe out an enemy force in 8 to 12 seconds. The Viet Cong below them had made critical mistakes. They'd set up their ambush facing the trail. Their backs were exposed to the hillside. They expected Americans to come from a predictable direction. They expected noise and helicopters and radio chatter. They'd never fought an enemy that hunted them the way they hunted others. Spider gave hand signals. His men understood without words. Line ambush formation. 3 men in front. 3 men covering the back in case more enemies showed up. Now move. Silently, carefully. They had to cover 60 meters through thick jungle to reach the perfect firing position. Every step took forever. Test the ground. Shift weight slowly. Don't snap a twig. Don't rustle leaves. Become part of the jungle itself. The jungle smelled like wet dirt and rotting plants. The cicadas kept screaming their endless song. Spider's heart rate stayed below 70 beats per minute. Training had taught him how to channel fear and adrenaline into focus instead of panic. His hands didn't shake. His breathing stayed controlled. Every sense sharpened to impossible clarity. 15 minutes to move 6 men 30 meters from an enemy force that outnumbered them more than 3 to 1. 15 minutes of absolute silence and control. 15 minutes of being invisible ghosts in a green hell. The Viet Cong still hadn't noticed anything wrong. They kept watching the trail below them. Weapons pointed away from the Australians. Some of them talked quietly. They were discussing the American patrol they expected to massacre. They were confident, relaxed. They'd done this before and it had worked. They had more men. They had automatic weapons. They had surprise on their side. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they'd become the prey. Spider's team reached their positions. Each man found a small gap in the vegetation that gave a clear line of sight. Each man identified his sector of responsibility. Each man controlled his breathing and waited for the signal. The F1 rifles came up smoothly. Safeties clicked off with sounds quieter than raindrops. Fingers rested on triggers with perfect pressure. Not enough to fire, just enough to feel the mechanism. Spider's hand raised, fingers spread. His men saw it, every muscle tensed, every sight picture locked on a target, every breath held, the moment stretched like rubber about to snap. 20 Viet Cong soldiers with automatic weapons had seconds left to live. They didn't know it yet. They were still laughing, still confident, still pointing their weapons the wrong direction. Spider's hand dropped. The killing began. 14:35 hours. The jungle exploded with thunder that had rhythm and purpose. 6 F1 rifles fired as one unit. The sound wasn't the ripping buzz of machine guns. It was precise. Crack, crack, crack. Each shot distinct. Each bullet flying exactly where it was aimed. The first volley dropped 8 Viet Cong before their brains could process what was happening. No warning, no incoming rounds to hear and take cover from. Just instant death arriving faster than sound. The VC scrambled for their weapons, tried to understand where the shooting came from. An AK-47 opened up, spraying bullets wildly into the trees above. The SAS trooper tracking that target adjusted his aim 1 tiny degree, fired twice. Both bullets hit center mass. The AK went silent. The man holding it fell without making a sound. 20 seconds had passed since Spider's hand dropped. 20 seconds, 8 enemies dead, 1 wounded and out of the fight. 11 left, but those 11 were panicking now. They'd expected to be the ambushers. Instead, they were dying and couldn't see who was killing them. American training would switch to suppression fire at this point. Pour hundreds of rounds downrange. Keep enemy heads down. Call for artillery. Call for helicopter gunships. Call for reinforcements. Wait for the cavalry to arrive with overwhelming firepower. But the SAS didn't have artillery on standby. They didn't have helicopters coming. They didn't have reinforcements. They had 120 bullets and 6 men who knew exactly how to use them. So they didn't suppress. They killed. The trooper on Spider's right flank tracked a VC trying to flank through heavy brush. The enemy thought the thick plants would hide him. He was wrong. The F-1's heavy bullet punched through leaves and vines like they weren't there. Single shot, 40 meters. The figure dropped and didn't move. No need for a second shot. The 7.62 millimeter round at that range meant instant neural shutdown. Your brain stopped working before you felt pain. Another VC threw a grenade. It tumbled through the air toward the Australian position, landed 6 meters from Spider. The SAS trooper who saw it threw one back, but he didn't throw it at the enemy. He threw it calculated to explode in the air above them. The grenade detonated 3 meters up. Shrapnel rained down, took down 2 fighters who'd been using tree trunks for cover. The trees couldn't protect them from metal falling from above. 45 seconds had passed. 45 seconds, 13 enemies down, 7 left. But those 7 weren't thinking about winning anymore. They were thinking about surviving, about running, about getting away from these ghosts who shot with impossible accuracy. 3 VC broke and ran. They sprinted away from the killing zone, made it 7 meters before measured rifle fire caught them. But the Australians didn't shoot to kill this time. They shot for legs, for hips, wounds instead of death. The 3 men fell screaming, and those screams did something important. They froze the last 4 enemies in place, made them unable to think, unable to act. Fear locked their muscles. The surviving. 4. VC tried the tactic that had worked against Americans. The hug, rush forward, close the distance, get so close that friendly artillery and air support becomes useless. Get close enough to use grenades and automatic fire. At close range, the AK-47's ability to spray 30 rounds in 3 seconds should win. That was the theory. That was what every manual said. They rushed forward, closed to 15 meters, started firing their AKs on full automatic. Bullets tore through leaves, smacked into tree trunks, kicked up dirt, but none hit their targets. The Australians had gone flat on the ground the instant they saw the rush coming, presenting the smallest possible target. And now they switched tactics. Point-blank headshots, no more center mass shooting, just heads. Easier to hit at 15 meters than 200 meters. The F-1's semi-automatic firing actually helped here. You couldn't panic and waste ammo. Each trigger pull was deliberate, aimed, controlled. One VC went down with a bullet through his forehead. Another took a round through his temple. The third tried to duck behind a tree. The fourth tried to reload his AK. They didn't make it. Spider put 2 rounds into the man behind the tree. He'd aimed for the visible shoulder and hip. The heavy bullets broke bones and severed arteries. The man fell. The last VC got his fresh magazine halfway into his rifle before 3 bullets from 3 different Australians hit him. He dropped with the magazine still in his hand. 2 minutes and 15 seconds, 135 seconds from first shot to last shot, total engagement time. The jungle went quiet except for the moaning of wounded men. Smoke drifted through the canopy. The smell of cordite mixed with the smell of blood and jungle plants. Cicadas started their screaming again like nothing had happened. 16 Viet Cong dead. 3 wounded badly enough they couldn't fight or run. 0 Australian casualties. Not a scratch. 94 rounds fired from the 120 carried. 78% accuracy under actual combat conditions. Against an enemy that outnumbered them more than 3 to 1. Against an enemy with automatic weapons and a prepared position. Spider's team moved immediately to what they called immediate action drills. They photographed the bodies, collected enemy documents from pockets, grabbed weapons to take back for intelligence, treated the 3 wounded VC as prisoners, got them stable enough to move. One trooper got on the radio and called for helicopter pickup. By 15-20 hours, the team was moving toward an open area 2 kilometers away where a helicopter could land. Behind them, they left a kill zone that would become a legend. Within days, the 274th Viet Cong Regiment received new orders. They came from high command. Someone had interviewed the 3 wounded prisoners. Someone had studied the battlefield. Someone had counted the shell casings. 20 different firing positions. 94 spent cartridges. 16 dead. The math told a story that terrified the people who understood it. A captured document from September 1966 spelled out the new orders. Do not engage small Australian reconnaissance teams. Their rifles fire slowly, but every bullet kills. They do not miss. They do not panic. They are more dangerous than American platoons with automatic weapons. Avoid contact unless you have overwhelming advantage and surprise. But even that wouldn't be enough, because you couldn't have surprise against an enemy who saw you first, who studied you first, who set up perfect kill zones and waited for you to walk into them. The VC had been the hunters for months. They'd ambushed Americans successfully over and over. They'd developed tactics that worked. But tactics that worked against Americans didn't work against Australians. And the 274th Regiment was about to learn that lesson 16 bodies at a time, over and over, until the jungle itself became a place they feared to enter, until they started avoiding entire areas just because Australian SAS might be there, until the very silence of the jungle became a weapon that killed without firing a shot. The 6 men reached the pickup zone. The helicopter came in low and fast. They loaded the wounded prisoners, loaded the captured documents and weapons, climbed aboard. The helicopter lifted up through the canopy and turned toward base. Below them, the jungle stretched in every direction, green and wet and endless. Somewhere down there, the VC were finding the bodies, counting them, trying to understand how 6 men with old-fashioned rifles had done this. They would never truly understand, because understanding required accepting that everything they thought they knew about firepower and tactics was wrong. And that was the hardest lesson of all. The ambush on August 18th wasn't special. It was normal. This was how Australian SAS operated every single day. What made it notable was that someone finally documented it. Someone counted the bodies. Someone wrote down the numbers. And those numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. Between August 1966 and November 1967, Australian SAS reconnaissance teams in Phuoc Tuy province achieved an 18-to-1 kill ratio. For every Australian who died, 18 enemy fighters were killed, 18-to-1. The team's casualty rate was 62% lower than American units doing similar missions. And intelligence value, SAS patrols generated 4.3 times more useful intelligence per day than normal reconnaissance units. They saw more, learned more, killed more, died less. The methods spread slowly through the Australian military. 3. Squadron. Trained for squadron. Senior soldiers taught new soldiers. By 1968, the entire Australian SAS regiment operated on the same principles: patience, precision, invisibility. Kill ratios that seemed impossible became normal, expected, required. New Zealand SAS adopted the Australian methods. British advisors incorporated the lessons into their own training. Some American Special Forces teams studied what the Australians were doing. They modified the tactics slightly, implemented them in their own operations. Small teams of Americans started getting similar results. Proof that this wasn't about being Australian. It was about training and discipline and a completely different way of thinking about jungle warfare. But full adoption never happened in the American military. The institution was too big, too invested in firepower and technology. The whole military machine was built around helicopters and artillery and airstrikes, around body counts and quick rotations and massive logistics. Adopting Australian methods would mean changing everything. It would mean accepting slower operations, valuing intelligence over body counts, prioritizing marksmanship over weight of fire. Most importantly, it required patience. And patience was impossible in a war measured by American politics and television news and quarterly reports to Congress. How do you tell the American public that success means moving 1 kilometer per day? How do you explain that the best operations are ones where nothing happens because you gathered intelligence without being seen? How do you sell patience when everyone wants results now? So the methods stayed mostly with special operations units, small teams, elite soldiers. The bulk of American forces kept operating the same way, and they kept taking casualties that better tactics could have prevented. The Viet Cong adapted to Australian operations. They stopped setting quick ambushes in areas where SAS might be operating. They increased their patrol sizes to 40 or 50 fighters when moving through Phuoc Toi province. They improved their own noise discipline, reduced cooking fires, changed movement patterns. They'd learned fear. The 274th Regiment started teaching their soldiers to fear silence. American operations were loud. You heard them coming. You had time to prepare. But Australian operations were silent. The jungle would be quiet, completely normal. And then suddenly you'd be dead. Your whole unit dead. And you'd never see who killed you. Never hear them coming. Never get a chance to fight back. Captured documents showed this fear clearly. Instructions to avoid certain areas entirely. Orders to move only in large groups. Warnings that small Australian teams were more dangerous than large American units. The psychological impact went beyond the kill ratios. The VC started avoiding successful operations not because they'd lost battles there, but because they were terrified of battles they couldn't fight. Sergeant Bob Wilson survived Vietnam, came home to Australia in 1968. He trained another generation of SAS soldiers, passed on the lessons written in blood and proven in jungle kill zones. Those soldiers carried the doctrine to East Timor decades later, then to Iraq, then to Afghanistan. The F1 rifle itself became obsolete, got replaced by M4 carbines, then other modern weapons. But the philosophy stayed the same. Discipline beats firepower, precision beats volume, patience beats aggression. Modern special operations doctrine traces directly back to those jungle patrols 50 years ago. The understanding that superior training can overcome technology disadvantages. That 6 highly trained soldiers can achieve what 40 normal soldiers cannot. That the weapon matters less than the person holding it and the mind controlling that person. But the lessons remain, written into training manuals, taught at military schools worldwide, passed from experienced soldiers to new recruits. The understanding that discipline is a weapon more powerful than any rifle. That precision multiplies force beyond what mathematics predicts. That the slowest rifle in trained hands is deadlier than the fastest rifle in panicked hands. The Viet Cong learned this lesson the hard way, documented it in their own words, changed their entire operational doctrine because of it. The world's militaries learned it from Australian example, from statistics that couldn't be argued with, from kill ratios that seemed impossible until you understood the system that produced them. And somewhere in that dense green jungle of Phuoc Thai province, the land remembers the day 16 men with automatic weapons died in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Killed by 6 men with rifles everyone said were obsolete. Killed by patience and precision and discipline that transformed disadvantage into dominance. The jungle remembers even though no one is left to tell the story. Remembers in the soil that drank blood, in the trees that caught bullets, in the silence that followed thunder.